Hey, what is up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Gran Turismo 7 update 1.46. In today's video I'm going to give you my initial thoughts and opinions on the 3 new vehicles which came alongside update 1.46 to Gran Turismo 7. However, before we get into my individual opinion on the cars themselves, I do want to give a general overview, and it's more a rant at the game itself than it is the actual cars that came alongside the update. Now, don't get me wrong, I am very, traditional in my ways. I don't really like the fact that EV is probably going to end up being the future. I'm not a massive fan of EV cars, and for me, anything with a massive engine and a ton of horsepower is always going to be much more cooler than anything that is running off electric. So with that being said, the one car I don't really need to talk about because it's self-explanatory is the Chevy Chevelle. It's a big old American muscle car. However, I do feel I need to touch on the other 2 vehicles with this update. The first of which is the Skoda, which is EV and obviously a VGT, and the AFEELA, which is an EV sort of cross promotion between Sony and Honda. So let's touch on the Skoda VGT first, because to be totally honest, I don't hate this car. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very limited in its use, and the fact it's a VGT means it's also very limited in terms of customizable options, performance options, and all that kind of such. However, what it does mean is that we will probably see more of Skoda in both GT7 and future iterations of the franchise, and that's not a bad thing. I appreciate it in the sense that this is probably Skoda's introduction to the series, and we will probably see them a lot more over time. The more manufacturers on board this series, the better for the future of the series. The AFEELA, well, it was obvious this would come to the game considering Gran Turismo is Sony's flagship racing series. What better place to put your, partnership vehicle in game than obviously in your flagship racing title. So it totally makes sense. It was very obvious this one would end up coming to the game anyway. So the 2 EV cars, are they really that interesting to the core audience of Gran Turismo? Well, absolutely not. Let's be totally honest. However, I do like to go into both my initial reactions and my individual reviews with an open mind as possible. This way I can leave my personal biases at the door and review the car for what it actually is. And that is going to hammer home this point. It is not the car's fault that they're really not that interesting or really that good in game. In fact, I would say the key issue with these cars, even if they don't appeal to the core audience, they could be made 100 times more interesting by actually having proper events catered towards them. It makes no sense that Polyphony will go and spend the 280 plus days or whatever time it takes to create one single car model just to put it in game for the fact of 5 to 10 minutes use by their average player. In my opinion, it is just a massive waste of resources to be creating these cars for 280 plus days to put them in game and then have them used for all of 5 to 10 minutes or maybe not at all. Surely Polyphony know that these cars are not catering towards their key audience. So obviously if it isn't aiming at the key audience, why not try and at least make them as interesting as possible? And the best way to do this would just be to cater proper decent events towards those cars that last more than 5 to 10 minutes. This way people might actually want to use these cars and actually make use of them no matter what their original bias is. And this way we actually feel like we're getting some proper use out of the new content. The fact is you are now at a roster of 500 cars and there is probably only 100 of them that are actually catered for properly, and the majority of them are group vehicles. Apart from a couple of engine swap road cars and one single 600 pp event and one single 700 pp event, the majority of the cars in game have almost no use other than 5 to 10 minute sprint races, in which is just not good enough. The key thing your player base has pointed out ever since the game launched is that the events need to be worthwhile, making use of all the tracks in game and making use of all the cars in game. You now have a roster of 500 plus cars, and like I mentioned, only a slight handful of them are actually useful. And the fact that this continues to fall on deaf ears to Polyphony, with them only really addressing it once in March or April of 2022 when the game actually got absolutely reviewed review bombed and criticised to no end on launch, and because of that messy launch. That was the only time they've ever really spoken about it. Since then, no matter how much the players complain on their social medias, or whether that would be on the YouTube for update trailers, it just falls on constant deaf ears. And the fact that Polyphony won't sit there and at least address some of this and take note of some of this, or even acknowledge the fact that this is what their player base is asking for, is absolutely ridiculous. Why go to the effort of creating a car for 280 plus days like you guys claim for it to be little to no use? It's absolutely bizarre, and this is where my point comes through, that even if the cars aren't that necessarily interesting to your core audience, you should be pushing it that these cars can be fun, can be enjoyable, and can be useful to your audience of the game. Again, it's ridiculous that Polyphony continue to ignore these complaints. So there we go, rant over. It's not the car's fault, it's Polyphony's fault for not catering towards these cars properly and at least making the best of a bad situation, even if it doesn't necessarily appeal to the core audience at first. So let's talk about each individual car. First up, the Skoda VGT. This is essentially the poster car slash hero car of this update. Surprisingly enough, it's going to set you back 1,000,000 credits. This is the standard price for a VGT vehicle, so really no difference from anything else there. In terms of the, I guess, liveries or colours, there is two of them. There is that horrible green and then the fairly nice Skoda liveried silver. In terms of customization options, it's fairly limited. There isn't really anything that you can do to this car, so if you was expecting to wide body it or change anything such as the wheels or performance upgrades, yep, there is absolutely none of that. This car is what you get. The only real changes you can make is the likes of the tyre compound and ballast and power restrictors, and that is totally your lot. There is really nothing else you can do to this car. However, I think this was pretty much expected considering this is a vision car slash concept car. So again, customization and performance upgrades are very limited, to be expected really. So let's talk about the way it drives. In fact, I used this for all of the VGT trophy events. I thought I'd actually try and get some use out of this. You're seeing footage from the new event, which is on Grand Valley Highway 1, and I actually found that the car is relatively fun to drive. It really wasn't as bad or as boring as I expected. I do have a criticism though, and that is to do with the cockpit cam. It's horrific. The stupid visor thing at the top is very frustrating. Whilst it could have been cool, the fact that it never seemed to budge off brake 70-30 and traction too, even when you can see we're running no traction, was just absolutely frustrating. A bit of a waste and a bit of a static image just kind of plastered across your screen. But in terms of the way it drives, it was actually much more fun than I expected. Again, I'm not a huge fan of EVs, but the fact is this car was actually relatively quick and relatively enjoyable to drive throughout all of the VGT trophy events. However, my main complaint comes into effect here, that if you take it anywhere where fuel consumption is enabled, this thing will run out of charge in no time. There is no way to change the mapping of the engine, and it recharges through the brakes, but not enough that it can actually survive more than the likes of 2 to 3 laps maximum. Unfortunately, it falls into the trap that the majority of EVs do, that they are very limited in use, and it's a shame because actually this car did exceed my very low expectations for it, and it could have just been much better in terms of the potential that was there. So let's move on next to the AFEELA, the Sony Honda mobility vehicle. As you can see, the AFEELA prototype 2024 is completely free as many times as you want. So if you really do want to put yourself through the torture of purchasing 20, 30, 50 of these things, you can, and you will never be charged. However, in terms of this car, I probably spent more time actually making junk car liveries for it than I actually have driving it. However, I did try and give it the benefit of the doubt to see if I could find any use with this vehicle. However, before I quickly touch on that, I am going to obviously talk about the way this car drives. And, well, surprisingly enough, it wasn't as bad as I originally expected it to be. Now, this is a fairly standard 550 pp EV car. In terms of the customizability options, there is little to none, so if you was expecting to be able to put some weird and wacky body kit on or wide body it, yeah, unfortunately that's not going to happen. However, you can actually change some of the wheels, unlike with the Skoda VGT. So there is a few options in terms of wheel changes if that is your thing, but apart from that and a number plate change, that is going to be a lot. There is not really much to talk on when it comes to customizable options. However, when it comes to talking about the way it drives, like I mentioned, this is a fairly standard 550 pp car. In fact, for the race that it was catered for with the 550 event for the Japanese cars, it was actually a lot of fun. I did mention this in my events guide that, to be totally fair, it drove much better than I originally expected. So once again, just like the Skoda, it did exceed my expectations, and in fact one of the best features for this car is that pretty cool interior cam. It's certainly one I'm going to be checking out in VR, so in that sense it is an enjoyable vehicle. It drives better than you're probably expecting, it has a fairly cool interior. However, just like the Skoda VGT, that is unfortunately where the plus points end. Like I mentioned, I tried to make use out of this vehicle, trying it in both 600 pp Tokyo and 700 pp Le Mans, and unfortunately, just like this Skoda, whilst the battery is a little bit better and again it does recharge itself under braking, it's not enough to actually make the car do more than a couple of laps at most. After that, the charge is going to be completely gone and you're going to be left with a dead car unless you're pitting every single lap. Again, wasted potential here on a car that could have been made interesting. And finally, that's going to move me into the saving grace of this update, costing you 163,000 credits from a legendary dealer, the Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 from 1970, the classic American muscle car, and one of my favourite muscle cars that ever existed, finally comes in all its beauty and all its glory to Gran Turismo 7. And I'm pleased to report this one is much more usable than a total of 30 minutes. It can actually be grinded with, it can be customized to your heart's content in the fact that you can do many enjoyable builds with this car. I've had a ton of fun with this one, and for me, this car alone completely saved this update. Now, in terms of customization options, you can go ahead and actually wide body this one, in the weird sense that it doesn't actually wide body it, it just kind of de-chromes it. So again, whilst they kind of categorize it as a wide body, it's not necessarily that, it just removes the chrome trim from the actual arches. However, you cannot do the same with the front and rear bumper, which is a massive missed opportunity. In fact, the customization was much more limited than I originally expected when it came to the Chevelle. I expected us to be able to sort of de-chrome the entire car, a little bit like the C2 Corvette, which came in the middle of last year. However, you can still add aero options to it if you want to have that big front lip on the vehicle, and when it comes to the wing, there is a few options here, including a very awesome drag wing if you do want to go for that sort of style. But again, for me, it's a circuit based racing game and I did have to go for a bit of a spoiler option on my builds. However, there is still a few more options than what we've seen with the EV vehicles, so you can get an overall different custom look to this vehicle if you do so wish. So obviously that's then going to move me into how does this car drive, and funnily enough, this is actually going to be the worst of the bunch out the box, and that is mainly down to the compound of tyre that it puts it on. It puts it on comforts, and with this being a big old high horsepower American muscle car, it drives like absolute garbage unless you start making some changes. I do recommend straight away putting a set of sports tyres on over the comforts. There is a lot of power in this car and it just handles like absolute junk if you don't change that compound. You may also want to change the suspension as well, as it is a bit of a high ride height to begin with and will sort of roll about like there is no tomorrow. However, I am pleased to report that once that was out the way and done with, pretty much standard with no extra horsepower added, this car is very enjoyable to drive and definitely the best of the bunch. In terms of interior, again, it's just typical what to expect from a classic American muscle car. Not much going on on to today's standard, but very, very clean and very, very pretty to look at. In terms of the usability of this car, I am pleased to report that whether you want to customize it to 600 or 700 pp, it can work at both of those, I guess, performance ranges. However, just note this is an American muscle car. It's very thirsty, it's not very fuel efficient, so you will need to be sort of lifting and coasting if you want to drag out that fuel consumption as long as possible. However, customized properly, it's very good on its tire life, which was a, I guess, fair surprise for me. Overall, definitely the best car of the bunch and an absolute stunning American muscle car classic that finally joins Gran Turismo 7, along with the likes of the Dodge Charger, which came with update 1.40 last November. Overall, a decent car and an absolute stunner to match. So there we go, that's my initial thoughts on the update 1.46 vehicles. Like I mentioned, when it comes to the EVs, I don't necessarily think it's the car's fault. It's just the fact that there is nothing for them to really do in the long term of Gran Turismo 7. As for the Chevelle, it's an absolutely amazing car, if not a little bit on the thirsty side. Anyway, big thank you to all of my channel members and a big thank you for you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.